Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that might disturb your sleep in the most fascinating way possible. Do you think you know death? You think you understand funeral practices? Well, the ancient world of biblical times had funeral customs so bizarre, so intricate, and so deeply strange that they make modern practices look like child's play. We're diving deep into the world of biblical funeral practices tonight. Not the sanitized Sunday school version, but the real, gritty, often disturbing reality of how people dealt with death 3,000 years ago. From professional mourners who wailed for coins to burial practices that would horrify modern sensibilities. From supernatural beliefs about the dead that governed entire societies to resurrection practices that blurred the line between medicine and magic. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world, especially when we're exploring something as universal yet culturally specific as death. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Because tonight, we're not just learning about death. We're discovering how the living created elaborate, sometimes terrifying rituals to deal with the one thing that terrified them most, the great unknown that awaits us all. The sacred art of preparing the dead. You wake up in ancient Jerusalem, around 800 BCE, and the sound that greets you isn't the call of merchants or the bleating of sheep. It's wailing. Deep, guttural wailing that seems to come from the very stones of the city itself. Someone has died, and you're about to witness funeral preparation practices so elaborate and strange that they make modern embalming look like a gentle spa treatment. You're standing outside a modest stone house where an elderly patriarch has just breathed his last. The family doesn't call a funeral director. There aren't any. Instead, they begin a ritual that's been passed down through generations. A sacred choreography of death that you've never seen before. The first thing you notice is speed. In the desert heat of Palestine, decomposition begins immediately, and Jewish law demands burial within 24 hours. But this isn't a rushed, panicked affair. It's a carefully orchestrated dance with death itself. The women of the family, led by the eldest daughter, begin the ritual of preparing the body. They don't handle this casually. Every movement is deliberate, every action steeped in religious significance. You watch as they carefully remove the patriarch's clothing, and you realize something shocking. In a culture where modesty is paramount, where even a glimpse of ankle can cause scandal, death temporarily suspends these rules. The women wash the body with water that's been specially prepared, mixed with aromatic spices that were worth more than most people earned in a month. Myrrh, aloe, frankincense. These aren't just pleasant scents. They're sacred substances that were believed to ease the soul's transition from this world to the next. But here's where it gets truly strange. You notice that they're not just washing. They're having conversations with the corpse. The daughter speaks to her father as if he can hear every word, updating him on family news, asking for his blessing on upcoming marriages, even consulting him about business decisions. To your modern sensibilities, this seems like denial or madness. But to them, the dead weren't truly gone. They were simply in transition. The binding comes next, and it's unlike anything you've imagined. Using strips of linen that have been soaking in those expensive spices, they begin wrapping the body with a precision that would make a surgeon jealous. But they don't wrap him like a mummy. That's Egyptian. And these people have their own ways. The Jews bind the limbs separately first, arms to the body, legs together, then wrap the torso in one continuous spiral, creating a cocoon that smells like paradise but looks oddly restrictive. The face receives special attention. A separate cloth, called a sudarium, is placed over the head and face, not wrapped around, but laid carefully like a veil. This isn't just about dignity. They believe the face is where the soul resides longest after death, and covering it helps the spirit let go of earthly concerns. You realize you're watching a people who have turned death into a holy sacrament. What strikes you most is the women's expertise. These aren't professional embalmers. They're mothers, sisters, daughters who have performed this ritual countless times. Death is so common in their world that every woman becomes an expert in its management. Child mortality is staggering. Wars are frequent. Diseases sweep through communities like wildfire. These women have gentle, practiced hands because they've had to use them so often. You notice something else remarkable. The men are largely absent from this process. In a patriarchal society where women have limited public roles, death preparation is entirely feminine domain. The same culture that prevents women from speaking in public meetings or handling financial transactions trusts them completely with the sacred transition from life to death. It's as if death temporarily inverts their entire social structure. The spices they use aren't random. Each has specific properties and meanings. Myrrh, which comes from tree resin, represents suffering but also purification. Aloe provides preservation and is associated with immortality. Frankincense, the most expensive of all, carries prayers to heaven with its smoke. These women are essentially turning the corpse into a prayer, a physical petition to the divine made from flesh and sacred plants. As the preparation continues, you realize this isn't just about hygiene or preservation. It's about transformation. They're not simply preparing a dead body for burial. They're facilitating a metamorphosis from human to ancestor, from flesh to spirit, from temporal to eternal. Every wrap of cloth, every application of spice, every whispered prayer is designed to help the soul complete its journey. The process takes hours, and during this time, the house fills with a strange mixture of grief and celebration. People come and go, bringing food, offering help, sharing memories. But underneath it all is this constant, methodical preparation of the dead, carried out by women who treat the corpse with more reverence than they would show a living king. By the time they finish, what was once a man has become something else entirely. A sacred bundle, a religious artifact, a bridge between worlds. The patriarch no longer looks human. He looks like a cocoon waiting for some spiritual butterfly to emerge. And in their belief system, that's exactly what he is. The professional mourners and their dark art. You're walking through the streets of ancient Damascus when a sound stops you cold. Not just crying, but something far more theatrical and disturbing. It's professional mourning, and you're about to discover that in the biblical world, grief was an art form, a performance, and a business all rolled into one spine-chilling package. The sound is coming from a wealthy merchant's house where the family patriarch has died. But the voices you hear aren't just family members. They're professionals, hired mourners who have turned lamentation into a lucrative career. You peer around the corner and see something that makes your modern sensibilities recoil. Women dressed in torn black robes, their hair disheveled, their faces streaked with ash and tears, wailing with an intensity that seems almost inhuman. These aren't just random women hired to cry. You're looking at skilled artisans of grief, each with her own specialty, her own repertoire of lamentations, her own signature style of expressing sorrow. There's the lead mourner, a woman in her 60s whose voice can shatter pottery and whose theatrical gestures would make Broadway actresses jealous. She's surrounded by her apprentices, younger women learning the trade, practicing their wails, perfecting their technique of synchronized sobbing. What strikes you immediately is how organized this all is. The mourners aren't just randomly crying. They're following a script, a traditional pattern of lamentation that's been refined over generations. The lead mourner begins with a high, keen wail that sets the key for everyone else. Then the apprentices join in, their voices weaving together in harmonies of grief that are both beautiful and terrifying. It's like a demonic choir, if demons specialized in human sorrow. You watch in fascination as they perform what you realize are specific mourning rituals. They throw dust and ashes on their heads with practiced precision, ensuring maximum dramatic effect. They tear at their clothes, but not randomly. The tears are strategic, placed to suggest overwhelming grief while still maintaining modesty. These women have calculated exactly how much skin they can show, how much hair they can dishevel, how much makeup they can smear, while still remaining within social boundaries. The most disturbing part isn't the wailing, it's the authenticity of it. These women, despite being paid performers, seem genuinely overcome with grief. You realize that professional mourners aren't just acting. They're channeling real sorrow, real loss, real human suffering. Many of them became mourners after losing children, husbands, or parents of their own. They've taken their personal tragedies and transformed them into a profession. The biblical world didn't see anything unusual about hired grief. In fact, it was considered essential for a proper funeral. The belief was that the dead needed to hear mourning to know they were truly loved, to be reassured before beginning their journey to the afterlife. Silence at a death was considered a form of abandonment, a way of telling the deceased that their life hadn't mattered. Professional mourners guaranteed that no one died unmourned, regardless of how unpopular they might have been in life. You notice the economic aspect of this practice. The wealthy merchant family has hired an entire troop of mourners, the lead mourner, her assistants, even children trained to sob on cue. But you can see poorer families in the street who can only afford one or two mourners, or who rely on family members to provide their own amateur wailing. Death, even in the ancient world, had its class distinctions. The mourners don't just cry, they tell stories. Between wails, the lead mourner recounts the deceased's life, his accomplishments, his kindnesses, his importance to the community. But these aren't just factual recitations. They're dramatic narratives designed to maximize emotional impact. She emphasizes his generosity, exaggerates his wisdom, transforms him into a figure worthy of the grief being displayed. You realize that professional mourners were also professional mythmakers, crafting legends from ordinary lives. What's most unsettling is how the mourners interact with the dead body. They approach the burial shroud, touch it, speak directly to the corpse as if it can hear them. They ask rhetorical questions. Why did you leave us? How will we survive without you? Who will protect your children? These aren't just performance pieces. They're believed to be actual communications with the dead, conversations that the deceased needs to hear before departing for the next world. The training for professional mourners was extensive and began in childhood. Young girls were taught to recognize different types of deaths and the appropriate mourning responses for each. The death of a child required different lamentations than the death of an elder. A death in war called for different wailing than a death from disease. A sudden death needed different expressions of grief than a long illness. These women were grief specialists with expertise in every conceivable form of human sorrow. You notice that the mourning isn't constant. It comes in waves, carefully orchestrated to maximize emotional impact. The mourners will build to a crescendo of wailing, then drop to whispers, then explode again into full-throated grief. This isn't accidental. It's a sophisticated understanding of how human emotion works, how to keep people engaged, how to prevent grief fatigue while maintaining the intensity necessary for proper mourning. The strangest part is how the community responds to these professional mourners. Neighbors emerge from their houses, drawn by the wailing, and they begin crying too. Not because they knew the deceased well, but because the mourner's performance is so compelling that it triggers genuine emotional responses in observers. You're watching emotional contagion in action, professional grief spreading through a community like a virus. As the mourning reaches its peak, you realize you're witnessing something profound about human nature. These people understood that grief needed expression, that sorrow required witnesses, that the dead deserved elaborate farewells regardless of economic status. Professional mourners weren't a sign of shallow emotion, they were a guarantee that no one would face death's finality in silence. Tombs, caves, and the architecture of eternity, you're standing on a hillside outside Jerusalem, looking at what appears to be a small city carved directly into the rock face. These aren't buildings for the living. They're elaborate tombs, underground mansions designed to house the dead for eternity. You're about to explore burial architecture so sophisticated and strange that it reveals an entire philosophy about death, family, and the afterlife that most people have never considered. The tomb entrance in front of you looks deceptively simple, just a low doorway sealed with a massive round stone. But this rolling stone, which weighs nearly 2 tons, isn't just a practical barrier. It's a statement, a declaration that what lies beyond is sacred space, different from the world of the living. You watch as a family arrives to bury their patriarch, and it takes 6 strong men just to roll the stone aside, revealing the darkness within. As you follow them into the tomb, the first thing that strikes you is the smell. Not decay, as you might expect, but aromatic spices mixed with the mineral scent of carved stone. The entrance tunnel, called a dromos, slopes downward into the earth, and you realize this isn't just a hole in the ground. This is architecture, carefully planned and executed with the same precision they'd use for a palace. The tomb opens into multiple chambers, each carved with tools that left distinctive marks in the stone. The main burial chamber is surprisingly spacious, with niches carved into the walls like stone bunk beds. These aren't random holes. They're precisely measured to accommodate human bodies, with slightly raised platforms to keep the corpses from touching the floor. Each niche represents years of labor, hours of careful chiseling, a family's investment in their eternal future. What's truly remarkable is the organization system. You notice that the niches are arranged hierarchically. The patriarch gets the largest, most central location, his wife beside him, children and relatives arranged by importance and age. It's like a family tree carved in stone, a permanent record of lineage and social structure. Death doesn't eliminate family hierarchies. It crystallizes them forever. But here's where it gets strange. After a year in the niches, when the bodies have decomposed, the bones are collected and placed in stone boxes called ossuaries. These aren't simple containers. They're often elaborately decorated with geometric patterns, floral designs, sometimes even inscriptions identifying the deceased. You realize you're looking at a 2-stage burial process. First decomposition, then final interment. The family doesn't just bury their dead once, they bury them twice. The practical reason for this system becomes clear as you explore deeper. Land for burial was expensive and limited, especially near cities. By moving bones to ossuaries after decomposition, families could reuse the niches for new deaths while keeping all their ancestors together in the same tomb. It's an ingenious solution to urban burial problems, but it also reveals something profound about their relationship with death. They expected to be intimately involved with their ancestors' remains for generations. You notice that these tombs aren't just burial places, they're family gathering spots. There are areas clearly designed for mourning rituals, spaces for leaving food offerings, even stone tables where families would eat memorial meals in the presence of their dead. The living didn't just visit these tombs occasionally. They integrated them into their ongoing family life. Death was a change of location, not a complete separation. The construction techniques are fascinating and disturbing. The soft limestone of Palestine was perfect for carving, but it also meant that tomb construction was incredibly labor-intensive. Families would begin preparing their burial cave while still healthy, spending years hollowing out chambers, smoothing surfaces, creating the architectural details that would house them forever. You're looking at people who lived their entire lives preparing for death. Some of the tombs you see are clearly wealthy. Multiple chambers, decorated entrances, even carved stone doors with elaborate locking mechanisms. But others are heartbreakingly modest, simple caves with basic niches. The burial places of people who scraped together everything they had to ensure their families would have a proper place to rest. Burial architecture was a form of conspicuous consumption, a way of displaying status that would last forever. The most unsettling discovery is how these tombs were sealed. The rolling stones aren't just heavy. They're shaped to fit precisely into grooved tracks, creating airtight seals that could only be opened from the outside. Once you're buried here, there's no way out. The engineering is sophisticated enough to last millennia, but it also reflects an absolute finality about death that modern sensibilities find disturbing. You realize that tomb robbery was a constant concern. The elaborate sealing mechanisms, the heavy stones, the sometimes hidden entrances. All of this was designed to protect the dead from thieves who would steal grave goods or even sell corpses. Families spent fortunes not just on the tombs themselves, but on security systems to protect their investments in death. The strangest aspect of these burial caves is how they reflect beliefs about the afterlife. The careful preservation of bones, the family groupings, the ongoing visitation. All of this suggests people who expected their dead to be somehow aware, somehow present, somehow continuing their family relationships even after death. These aren't just storage facilities for corpses. They're permanent homes for people who were believed to be not quite gone. As you emerge from the tomb complex, you realize you've been exploring more than burial architecture. You've been inside the minds of people who saw death as a continuation rather than an ending, who invested their life's wealth in their eternal future, who carved their family structures into solid rock as a hedge against the uncertainty of what comes next. Embalming secrets and preservation mysteries. You're in the house of a wealthy Hebrew merchant who has just died. But something extraordinary is happening. Instead of the rapid burial that Jewish law typically demands, his body is receiving the Egyptian treatment. You're about to witness the collision of two radically different approaches to death, and discover preservation practices so elaborate and mysterious that they blur the line between medicine, magic, and outright rebellion against natural decay. The merchant had spent years trading with Egypt, and he's arranged to have his body treated according to their methods. Despite the scandal this causes among his Orthodox neighbors, you watch as Egyptian embalmers arrive with their mysterious tools and chemicals, bringing with them knowledge that seems almost supernatural to the Hebrew observers. These men know secrets about preserving flesh that won't be understood by science for thousands of years. The first shocking thing you witness is the removal of organs. Using bronze hooks and knives that gleam like instruments of torture, the embalmers begin extracting the merchant's internal organs with surgical precision. This isn't the careful, reverent washing you saw with Hebrew burial preparation. This is systematic dismantling of the human body, performed with the casual expertise of butchers. The brain comes out through the nose, pulled out in pieces with long hooked instruments that make your stomach turn. What's most disturbing is how matter-of-fact the embalmers are about this process. They're not just removing organs randomly. Each organ has its specific purpose and destination. The liver, lungs, stomach, and intestines are cleaned, dried, and placed in separate canopic jars, each protected by a different Egyptian god. The heart, considered the seat of intelligence and emotion, is left in the body. They believe the deceased will need it for judgment in the afterlife. You realize you're watching people who have developed a sophisticated understanding of human anatomy through centuries of working with corpses. These embalmers know exactly which organs decay fastest, which cause the most putrefaction, which can be safely removed without damaging the body's external appearance. Their knowledge of human physiology rivals that of physicians, but it's knowledge gained through death rather than life. The preservation chemicals they use are expensive beyond imagination. Natron, a naturally occurring salt found only in specific Egyptian locations, is applied in massive quantities to draw moisture from the tissues. Cedar oil is injected into body cavities to kill bacteria and prevent internal decay. Myrrh and frankincense, worth more than gold, are used not just for their pleasant scents, but for their antimicrobial properties. This merchant's family is literally spending a fortune to delay the inevitable. What strikes you most is the time involved. While Hebrew burial happens within 24 hours, Egyptian mummification takes 70 days. For over 2 months, the merchant's body will lie in natron salts, slowly desiccating, while his family waits and his neighbors gossip about the foreign practices being performed in their midst. This isn't just preservation. It's a complete suspension of the normal rhythm of death and burial. The wrapping process is even more complex than the organ removal. The embalmers use hundreds of yards of linen strips, each one carefully placed and secured with tree resin that hardens like glue. But this isn't random wrapping. They're following specific patterns, creating a textile sculpture that transforms the merchant into something that no longer looks quite human. Each finger is wrapped individually. Each toe receives its own binding. The face is covered with layers of linen and resin until only the general shape of humanity remains. You notice that the Hebrew family members watching this process are deeply conflicted. Their religious law demands rapid burial in simple linen shrouds, but they're fascinated by the Egyptian promise of eternal preservation. Some whisper that this treatment is blasphemous, an attempt to cheat God's natural order. Others argue that if their patriarch can afford it, why shouldn't he have the best possible protection against decay? The most mysterious aspect of the mummification is the magical elements. The embalmers don't just work in silence. They chant incantations, place amulets between the wrapping layers, perform rituals that seem designed to transform the corpse into something supernatural. You realize this isn't just preservation. It's an attempt to create a different kind of being, something between human and divine, natural and magical. The cost of this process is staggering. By the time the mummification is complete, the merchant's family has spent what would normally buy a house, multiple servants, or a small farm. This is literally a king's ransom spent on a dead body. Money that could have supported the living for years, instead invested in the preservation of the dead. It's a choice that reveals profound beliefs about the importance of physical preservation for spiritual survival. What's most unsettling is how successful the process is. When the embalmers finally unwrap their work after the 70-day treatment, what emerges looks nothing like the merchant who died, but it's perfectly preserved. The skin is leathery but intact, the features recognizable, the body shape maintained. They've achieved something that seems impossible. They've stopped death in its tracks, at least physically. As you watch the final stages of the mummification process, you realize you're witnessing a fundamental disagreement about the nature of death itself. The Hebrew tradition accepts decay as natural and focuses on spiritual transition. The Egyptian approach treats decay as an enemy to be defeated through chemistry and magic. The merchant's family has chosen to reject their own cultural understanding of death in favor of foreign promises of physical immortality. The finished mummy is placed in a wooden sarcophagus decorated with Egyptian motifs, but inscribed with Hebrew prayers, a hybrid creation that reflects the cultural confusion of the family. They've created something that belongs fully to neither tradition, a preserved corpse that represents the collision between two completely different ways of understanding what happens when we die. The spectacle of biblical funeral processions. You're standing on the walls of ancient Jerusalem as the gates swing open and the most elaborate funeral procession you've ever imagined begins to wind its way toward the city cemetery. This isn't just the movement of a corpse from house to grave. It's theater, politics, social commentary, and religious ritual all rolled into one spectacular display that reveals more about the living than the dead. The procession is led by professional musicians, not playing somber hymns, but creating a cacophony of wailing instruments that can be heard for miles. Flutes, drums, cymbals, and horns compete with each other in a symphony of grief that's designed to announce this death to every living person within earshot. The noise is overwhelming, almost violent in its intensity, and you realize that biblical funerals weren't quiet, dignified affairs. They were sonic assaults on the senses. Behind the musicians come the professional mourners you encountered earlier, but now they're performing in full public display. They've torn their clothes more dramatically, covered themselves with more ash and dust, and their wailing has reached fever pitch. But you notice something fascinating. They're not just crying randomly. Their lamentations follow the rhythm of the procession, creating a kind of walking opera where every step is synchronized with expressions of grief. The social hierarchy of the procession is immediately obvious and brutally honest. The deceased, wrapped in expensive linen and carried on an ornate bier, is surrounded by male relatives arranged by importance. The eldest son walks closest to the body, followed by brothers, cousins, and male friends in descending order of relationship and status. Behind them come the women, but not all women. Only those whose social standing qualifies them to grieve publicly. Servants and slaves follow at the very back, their grief acknowledged, but their social position maintained even in death. What strikes you immediately is how the procession functions as a kind of census of the dead person's life. Every relationship, every friendship, every business partnership is on display through physical proximity to the corpse. You can read the deceased's social network, his economic status, his family standing in the community, just by observing who walks where in the procession. It's a brutal but honest assessment of a life's worth measured in human relationships. The route itself is significant and carefully planned. The procession doesn't take the shortest path to the cemetery. It winds through the city streets, past the deceased's house, his place of business, the synagogue where he worshipped, the market where he conducted trade. It's a final tour of all the places that mattered in his life, a geographic summary of his existence played out for the entire city to witness. But this isn't just about honoring the dead. It's about intimidating the living. The size and elaborateness of the funeral procession sends clear messages about the family's wealth, their social connections, their ability to command respect and loyalty. Other families take note, measuring their own standing against what they see, planning their own funerals to match or exceed this display. You're watching competitive grieving, death, as social performance. The strangest element of the procession is how it interacts with daily life. Normal business doesn't stop for funerals. Merchants continue selling, children play in the streets, work continues. But the procession has right of way over everything else. And you watch as cart drivers pull aside, pedestrians press against walls, and normal traffic patterns completely reorganize themselves around the passage of the dead. Death temporarily reorganizes the entire urban landscape. You notice that spectators don't just watch passively, they participate. As the procession passes, people emerge from their houses to join the mourning, adding their voices to the wailing, throwing dust on their own heads in sympathy, sometimes even following the procession to the cemetery. Grief becomes contagious, spreading through the community like emotional wildfire. You realize that biblical funerals weren't private family affairs. They were community events that involved everyone. The most disturbing aspect is how the procession treats the corpse. The deceased isn't hidden away in a closed coffin. The face is visible, and mourners approach to touch the body, speak to it, even kiss it farewell. This direct physical contact with death, so shocking to modern sensibilities, is considered essential for proper grieving. The dead person remains part of the community until the moment of burial, not isolated from the living by funeral home practices. As the procession reaches the cemetery, you witness the final transformation. What began as an orderly parade gradually dissolves into chaos as grief reaches its climax. The professional mourners reach peak performance. Family members collapse in sorrow, and the entire procession becomes a mob of grieving humanity surrounding the corpse. Order breaks down completely as emotion takes over, and you realize this breakdown is intentional, a necessary catharsis that allows the community to purge its collective sorrow. The timing of biblical funeral processions was crucial and revealed deep beliefs about the relationship between the living and the dead. They typically began at noon, during the hottest part of the day, ensuring maximum visibility and community participation. But they also had to be completed before sunset, when Jewish law forbade travel and work. This created intense time pressure that added urgency to the entire proceeding, a race against time that reflected the race of life itself. What's most remarkable is how democratic these processions could be, despite their obvious class distinctions. Even the poorest families managed some version of public mourning. even if they could only afford a few hired moors and simple instruments. The community expected every death to be acknowledged publicly, and social pressure ensured that even enemies would participate in funeral processions to maintain their own standing in the community. As the procession finally reaches the burial site, you realize you've witnessed more than the transportation of a corpse. You've seen an entire society's way of processing death, displaying relationships, maintaining hierarchy, and creating community solidarity through shared grief. The funeral procession was ancient social media, a way of broadcasting life's significance and death's reality to everyone within sight and sound. Death omens and supernatural signs. You're sitting in a Hebrew household, just after sunset when the oil lamp flickers and dies without apparent cause. The family members exchange knowing glances, and you realize you've just witnessed what they believe is a death omen, one of hundreds of supernatural signs that biblical peoples use to predict, explain, and cope with mortality. You're about to discover a world where death casts shadows long before it arrives, where the supernatural and natural intertwine in ways that would seem impossible to modern thinking. The grandmother of the house begins speaking in a whisper about the meaning of the extinguished lamp. In their belief system, light sources dying unexpectedly mean that death is approaching the household. But it's not just any death. The specific way the flame went out provides crucial details. A flame that dies suddenly indicates sudden death, while one that flickers before going out suggests a lingering illness. A flame that goes out and then briefly reignites means someone will survive a brush with death. These people have developed an entire language of dying lights. But lamps are just the beginning. You learn that biblical people saw death omens everywhere, in animal behavior, weather patterns, dreams, even in the way food cooked or bread rose. A dog howling at night meant death was stalking the neighborhood. Birds flying into houses were messengers from the realm of the dead. Milk souring without cause, wine turning bitter, bread failing to rise. All of these were warnings that death was approaching someone in the community. What strikes you most is how seriously these omens were taken. This isn't superstition for entertainment. It's a survival system, a way of preparing for death in a world where medical knowledge was limited and death could strike anyone at any time. Families would change their behavior based on omens, bringing in physicians, saying final words to relatives, even arranging their affairs when signs suggested death was imminent. These beliefs had real consequences for real people. The most elaborate death omens involved dreams and visions. The biblical world believed that sleep brought people closer to the spirit realm, making dreams a primary communication channel between the living and the dead. You hear stories of people who dreamed of deceased relatives calling them by name, universally interpreted as invitations to join the dead. Dreams of water, especially crossing rivers or entering deep pools, were considered certain signs of approaching death. But dreams weren't just personal omens. They could predict deaths throughout the community. A person who dreamed of seeing their own reflection in dark water would soon die. Dreams of eating with the dead meant joining them was imminent. Dreams of climbing mountains or tall structures indicated the dreamer's soul was already beginning its journey to the afterlife. These people lived in a world where every night brought potential prophecies of death. Animal omens were particularly sophisticated and disturbing. Certain birds, especially owls, ravens, and vultures, were considered death messengers when they appeared in unusual places or numbers. But the interpretation depended on specific behaviors. An owl hooting during daylight meant sudden death was coming. Ravens gathering in unusual numbers indicated a plague or disaster. Vultures circling when no carrion was visible meant they sensed approaching death that humans couldn't yet detect. Even domestic animals provided death omens. Cows that refused to give milk, chickens that stopped laying eggs, dogs that howled for no apparent reason, cats that stared at empty corners of rooms. All of these behaviors were carefully monitored and interpreted. The biblical peoples believed animals were more sensitive to approaching death than humans. able to sense the presence of death spirits or the departure of life force before physical symptoms appeared. Weather patterns were another major category of death omens, and they reveal a people who saw the natural world as intimately connected to human mortality. Unusual cloud formations, especially those resembling human or animal shapes, were considered messages about specific deaths. Rain falling when skies appeared clear warned of tears to come. Wind that suddenly changed direction or stopped completely indicated that death spirits were moving through the area. The most chilling omens involved interactions with the dead themselves. People reported seeing recently deceased relatives in peripheral vision, hearing their voices calling from empty rooms, or smelling their distinctive scents in impossible locations. Rather than dismissing these as hallucinations, biblical culture interpreted them as actual communications from the dead, warnings about deaths to come or invitations to join them in the afterlife. What's most remarkable is how these beliefs created a complex early warning system for death. Families who noticed multiple omens would take protective actions, bringing in healers, performing protective rituals, even temporarily relocating to escape whatever death was approaching. Sometimes these actions seemed to work, which only reinforced belief in the omen system. When people survived despite dire omens, it was attributed to successful divine intervention, not random chance. The interpretation of death omens wasn't left to individuals. Communities had specialists, usually elderly women, who were experts in reading signs and predicting their meanings. These women held enormous power despite having little official status, because their interpretations could influence major family decisions. They were consulted about travel plans, business ventures, marriages, and other life choices that might be affected by approaching death. But perhaps the strangest aspect of death omens was how they created self-fulfilling prophecies. People who believed they were marked for death often acted in ways that made death more likely, becoming depressed, losing the will to fight illness, or taking dangerous risks because they believed their fate was already sealed. The belief system designed to provide early warning about death sometimes actually caused the deaths it predicted. As you listen to the family discuss the significance of the extinguished lamp, you realize you're witnessing a worldview where death isn't a sudden, unpredictable event. It's a process that begins long before physical symptoms appear. A spiritual reality that casts shadows into the material world. A force that can be sensed, interpreted, and sometimes even avoided by those wise enough to read tea. He signs. Resurrection beliefs and practices around the dead. You're in the tomb 3 days after the burial, accompanying the family on what seems like a routine visit to leave food offerings for their deceased patriarch. But suddenly, one of the mourners claims she heard movement from inside the burial shroud. What happens next reveals beliefs about resurrection so complex and strange that they blur the line between medicine, magic, and religious faith in ways that would shock modern believers. The family doesn't panic or call for authorities. They have specific protocols for exactly this situation. In the biblical world, the line between death and life wasn't as clear-cut as modern medicine makes it. They understood that sometimes people who appeared dead could return to life, and they had developed elaborate systems for dealing with resurrection, both natural and supernatural. The first thing they do is listen carefully for signs of life from within the tomb. But they don't rush to unwrap the body. That would violate both religious law and practical safety. Instead, they have a complex waiting period based on their understanding of different types of death. Someone who died suddenly might revive within hours. Someone who died from illness might take days. Someone who died violently might never return, no matter how long they waited. You learn that biblical peoples distinguished between several different types of death, each with its own resurrection possibilities. Sleep death was the most likely to reverse, when someone appeared to die peacefully but might only be in a deep coma. Fever death from illness could sometimes reverse if the person's natural healing powers overcame whatever disease had struck them. Spirit death, where the soul had actually departed, was considered permanent and final. What's most disturbing is how they tested for true death versus apparent death. The methods were crude, but surprisingly sophisticated. They would place mirrors near the mouth to check for breath, listen for heartbeats, even prick the skin with needles to test for responsiveness. But they also used techniques that seem almost supernatural, checking whether the deceased's fingernails and hair continued growing, whether the body maintained normal temperature, whether rigor mortis had set in completely. The waiting period before declaring death final was based on these observations. If fingernails appeared to grow, if the body remained flexible, if any signs of life persisted, they would delay burial and continue monitoring. Some families waited up to 7 days before proceeding with funeral rites, hoping for resurrection that might never come, but unwilling to risk burying someone who might recover. But biblical resurrection beliefs went far beyond medical misdiagnosis. They genuinely expected supernatural resurrections, divine interventions that could restore life to the truly dead. These weren't considered miracles in the modern sense. They were part of how the world worked. Divine powers that could be activated through proper prayers, rituals, and sometimes magical practices. The most elaborate resurrection attempts involved what could only be called necromancy, magical practices designed to call souls back from the dead. Families would bring special herbs, burn specific incenses, and perform rituals over the corpse that were designed to create conditions favorable for resurrection. These practices were officially forbidden by Hebrew law, but they happened anyway, usually in secret, performed by desperate families who couldn't accept final loss. You witness one of these resurrection attempts, and it's unlike anything you've imagined. The family has hired a woman who specializes in calling back the dead, a practitioner whose knowledge combines herbal medicine, spiritual practices, and what can only be described as ancient psychology. She doesn't claim to control resurrection. She claims to create optimal conditions for the soul to return if it chooses to. The ritual involves placing the body in specific positions, surrounding it with particular herbs and stones, and maintaining constant prayer and meditation for days at a time. The practitioner explains that resurrection requires perfect alignment between the physical body, the departed soul, and divine will. Most attempts fail, she admits, because one or more of these elements is missing. But sometimes, she claims, all three align and the dead return to life. What's most remarkable is how the community responds to claimed resurrections. Rather than skepticism, there's careful investigation. Elders examine the person who supposedly returned from death, looking for signs of genuine resurrection versus natural recovery from apparent death. They have specific tests, memories of the death experience, changes in personality or knowledge, physical signs of having truly died and returned. Confirmed resurrections, rare as they were, became community legends that reinforced belief in the possibility of return from death. These stories spread throughout Hebrew society, creating a cultural expectation that under the right circumstances, with proper faith and divine favor, death could be temporary rather than final. These beliefs profoundly influenced how people approached death, burial, and mourning. The most sophisticated aspect of biblical resurrection beliefs was their understanding of timing. They believed there were specific windows when resurrection was possible, usually within the first 3 days after death, before the soul completed its journey to the afterlife. After this period, resurrection became increasingly unlikely, requiring ever more dramatic divine intervention. This timing created intense pressure around burial decisions. Families had to balance religious requirements for rapid burial against hopes for possible resurrection. Some developed compromise solutions, partial burial that could be easily reversed, or burial in family tombs where bodies could be monitored and potentially retrieved if signs of life appeared. But perhaps the strangest aspect of biblical resurrection beliefs was how they influenced daily life among the living. People who believed in resurrection possibilities lived differently. They prepared for death while hoping it might not be final. They treated deceased family members as potentially temporary absent rather than permanently gone. And they maintained relationships with the dead that could theoretically be resumed if resurrection occurred. As you watch the family conduct their careful examination of their buried patriarch, listening for signs of returning life, you realize you're witnessing a worldview where death is understood as a transition that might be reversible, a temporary separation that could theoretically end in joyful reunion. Whether through medical recovery, divine intervention, or magical practice, resurrection remained a possibility that influenced every aspect of how these people understood and approached human mortality. Strange punishments and deaths in biblical times. You're standing in the public square of an ancient Hebrew city, and the crowd around you is buzzing with anticipation and horror. Today, you're going to witness execution methods so bizarre and brutal that they reveal a civilization's attempt to make death itself into a form of communication about justice, divine will, and social order. But these aren't simple killings. They're elaborate rituals of death designed to send messages that will echo through generations. The first execution method you witness is stoning, but it's nothing like the chaotic mob violence you might imagine. This is highly organized, almost ceremonial in its precision. The condemned man has been found guilty of adultery, and the entire community has gathered to participate in his death. But the process begins with a ritual that makes your blood run cold. The man must dig his own grave while the witnesses prepare the stones. What strikes you immediately is how democratic this form of execution is. Everyone participates, from children to elders, each person contributing their stone to the collective killing. But there are rules, strict protocols that govern who throws first. What size stones are appropriate, even where on the body they should aim. The accusers cast the first stones, establishing their commitment to the charges they've brought. Then the witnesses join in, followed by the general community. The psychological impact of stoning isn't just on the victim, it's on the executioners. By requiring community participation, this method ensures that everyone shares responsibility for the death, creating collective guilt and collective commitment to the justice system. Nobody can claim innocence or distance themselves from the execution, because everyone's hands are literally bloodied by the process. But stoning is just one of many execution methods, each designed for specific crimes and carrying particular symbolic meanings. For blasphemy, the punishment is particularly gruesome. The condemned person is pushed from a high place, usually a cliff or tall building, then stoned if they survive the fall. This two-stage execution represents rejection by both heaven, the fall from height, and earth, the stones from below. A complete cosmic condemnation. You witness a burning execution, reserved for particularly heinous sexual crimes. And the elaborateness of the preparation is shocking. The victim isn't simply set on fire. They're bound to a stake, surrounded by carefully arranged combustible materials designed to control the burning process. Different types of wood burn at different rates, and the executioners are experts in creating fires that kill quickly or slowly, depending on the severity of the crime and the message being sent. What's most disturbing about biblical executions is how they incorporate family members into the process. In cases of rebellious children, the parents are required to participate in the execution, sometimes even being the primary executioners. This isn't just punishment for the child. It's a test of the parent's commitment to social order over family loyalty. You watch a father struggle with the requirement to stone his own son, and you realize you're witnessing the deliberate destruction of family bonds in service to religious law. The strangest executions are those considered too impure for human hands. For certain religious violations, the condemned person is essentially turned over to divine judgment through methods that remove human agency from the killing. They might be exposed in the wilderness to die from exposure, wild animals, or divine intervention. They might be cast into the sea, allowing God to determine whether they sink or swim. These methods reflect beliefs that some crimes are so severe that only divine justice can address them. Crucifixion, the more associated with Roman occupation, was occasionally used in Hebrew society for the most serious crimes against the community. But the Hebrew version was different from Roman crucifixion. It was often preceded by scourging, involved different positioning of the body, and included specific rituals designed to maximize both physical suffering and spiritual significance. The condemned person wasn't just dying. They were being transformed into a living symbol of what happened to those who violated divine law. What's most chilling is how these executions were scheduled and advertised. Death wasn't a private affair conducted quickly and quietly. It was public entertainment, moral education, and social control all rolled into one spectacular event. Execution days were like festivals, with vendors selling food, families bringing children to watch, and entire communities treating death as both entertainment and instruction. The preparation of the condemned person reveals sophisticated understanding of psychology and social control. Before execution, victims were often required to confess their crimes publicly, detailing their violations and expressing repentance. But these confessions weren't just personal. They were designed to educate observers about the consequences of similar behavior. The dying person became a teacher, using their final moments to reinforce social norms. Some execution methods were designed to extend death over days or even weeks, creating prolonged public displays of suffering that served as ongoing moral lessons. Victims might be imprisoned in cages exposed to the elements, slowly starving while remaining visible to the community. They might be buried up to their necks and left to die from exposure and dehydration, their heads serving as constant reminders of justice being served. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of biblical executions was how they handled the bodies afterward. Depending on the crime, corpses might be denied burial entirely, left to be consumed by wild animals as a sign of ultimate divine rejection. Other bodies were buried in unmarked graves, their identities erased from community memory. Some were hung on trees or poles after death, displayed until decomposition served as a final lesson about the consequences of violating social order. The strangest punishment of all was reserved for those who violated the most sacred taboos. They were declared dead while still living, becoming social ghosts who were ignored by the community, denied all human contact, and treated as if they had already died. This social death often proved more effective than physical execution, creating living examples of what happened to those who crossed certain lines. As you witness these various forms of execution and punishment, you realize you're seeing a society that understood death as a form of communication, a way of sending messages about values, boundaries, and consequences that would be remembered long after the corpses had decomposed. These weren't just methods of killing. They were technologies of social control, using death itself as a tool for maintaining order in a world where survival depended on strict adherence to community norms. Mass burials, plagues, and catastrophic deaths. You're standing on the outskirts of ancient Jerusalem during the reign of King David. But something is terribly wrong. The normal sounds of city life, merchants calling, children playing, animals bleeding, have been replaced by an endless wailing that seems to come from the very stones themselves. A plague has struck, and you're about to witness mass death on a scale so overwhelming that it transforms every aspect of how a society deals with mortality. The first thing that hits you isn't visual, it's olfactory. The smell of death permeates everything. A sweet, sickening odor that clings to your clothes, your hair, your very skin. In normal times, Hebrew law requires burial within 24 hours. But when dozens of people die daily, that system breaks down completely. Bodies are stacking up faster than they can be processed. And the careful, reverent funeral practices you've witnessed are being abandoned out of pure necessity. You watch as families who would normally spend days preparing their dead for burial now wrap corpses in whatever cloth they can find and drag them to mass burial pits outside the city walls. The elaborate tomb complexes, the careful arrangement of bodies, the respectful spacing between graves. None of that matters when survival of the living depends on rapid disposal of the dead. You're witnessing the complete collapse of normal death customs under the pressure of catastrophic mortality. The mass burial pits are unlike anything you could imagine. Enormous trenches, dug by men who themselves might be dead within days, filled with bodies arranged in layers like some horrific archaeological stratum. There's no ceremony, no individual prayers, no careful positioning of corpses. Bodies are simply thrown in, covered with lime to speed decomposition and reduce disease transmission, then covered with dirt when the pit is full. Entire families disappear into these anonymous graves, their individual identities lost in the collective catastrophe. What's most disturbing is how quickly the community adapts to mass death. The professional mourners, who normally provide individual attention to each corpse, now work assembly line style, offering generic lamentations for groups of bodies simultaneously. The careful hierarchy of funeral processions disappears when so many important people are dead that there's no one left to maintain social distinctions. Death becomes democratizing in the most terrible way possible. You witness the breakdown of normal family structures around death. In regular times, specific relatives have specific roles in burial preparation. Eldest sons handle male corpses. Eldest daughters manage female bodies. Parents oversee children's funerals. But when entire families are wiped out, strangers end up handling the dead, violating all normal taboos about who can touch whom and how bodies should be prepared. The religious implications of mass burial are staggering. Hebrew law requires specific prayers for the dead, individual blessings, careful attention to each soul's transition to the afterlife. But when hundreds are dying daily, these requirements become impossible to fulfill. Religious leaders develop emergency protocols, generic prayers that can cover multiple deceased simultaneously, abbreviated rituals that address the spiritual needs of mass casualties, compromises between religious law and practical necessity that would be unthinkable under normal circumstances. The most shocking adaptation is how the community handles children's deaths during plagues. In normal times, child mortality is high, but each death receives significant attention. Children are considered especially precious because they're innocent of adult sins. But during catastrophic die-offs, children's bodies are processed with the same efficiency as adults. They're small corpses lost among the larger ones in mass graves that make no distinction based on age. You witness the psychological impact of mass burial on the survivors. People who have spent their entire lives believing in elaborate afterlife preparation, individual attention to each soul's needs, careful preservation of family burial traditions, are forced to abandon everything they've been taught about proper death practices. The guilt and spiritual terror this creates is almost as devastating as the physical disease itself. The logistics of mass death reveal insights into ancient society that normal mortality patterns would never expose. Who digs the burial pits when most laborers are dead or dying? How do communities dispose of corpses when normal burial grounds are overwhelmed? Where do they find enough lime, enough cloth, enough wood for funeral pyres when supply chains are disrupted by mass mortality? You're seeing a civilization stripped down to its most basic survival mechanisms. Some communities resort to burning corpses, despite religious prohibitions against cremation. When burial becomes impossible due to frozen ground, overwhelming numbers, or lack of able-bodied gravediggers, fire becomes the only practical solution. But these aren't the careful, ritualistic cremations of other cultures. They're desperate mass incineration, bodies burned in piles like refuse, their ashes scattered by wind rather than carefully preserved. The most disturbing mass burial sites are those created by military disasters. After major battles, the victorious army faces the problem of disposing of hundreds or thousands of enemy corpses before disease spreads to their own forces. You witness burial practices that are more like engineering projects than religious ceremonies. Massive trenches designed to hold specific numbers of bodies, calculated to minimize disease transmission while maximizing efficiency. What strikes you most is how mass death changes the relationship between the living and the dead. In normal times, deceased family members remain part of the community through ongoing tomb visits, memorial meals, and continued conversations with their spirits. But when people die in such numbers that their burial sites are unmarked mass graves, that ongoing relationship becomes impossible. The dead simply disappear, their individual identities lost in collective anonymity. The recovery process, after catastrophic mortality, reveals how deeply death practices are embedded in social structure. Communities that survive plagues or military disasters must rebuild not just their populations, but their entire system of death customs. They have to re-establish burial grounds, train new professional mourners, develop new family hierarchies around funeral responsibilities, essentially reconstructing their relationship with mortality from the ground up. As you witness the aftermath of mass burial, the unmarked grave sites that will eventually be forgotten, the disrupted family lineages that will never recover their ancestral burial traditions, the psychological trauma that will affect survivors for generations, you realize you're seeing what happens when death overwhelms a civilization's capacity to process it individually. Mass mortality doesn't just kill bodies. It kills cultures, traditions, and the very systems that make death meaningful to the living. Afterlife beliefs and their influence on funeral practices. You're sitting in the house of a Hebrew family during the week-long mourning period called Shiva. But something extraordinary is happening that reveals the deepest, most complex beliefs about what happens after death. The mourners aren't just grieving a loss. They're actively maintaining a relationship with someone they believe is transitioning between worlds. And their actions reveal an understanding of the afterlife so sophisticated and strange that it influences every aspect of how they treat the dead. The first thing you notice is how the family continues to set a place at the table for the deceased patriarch. This isn't symbolic remembrance. They genuinely believe he might return for meals. During the transitional period between death and final departure to the afterlife, they leave his favorite foods, maintain his chair exactly as he left it, even continue conversations with him as if he's present but invisible. You're witnessing people who understand death not as an event but as a process, a gradual separation that takes time to complete. The Hebrew concept of the afterlife is far more complex than simple heaven or hell. They believe in Sheol, a shadowy underworld where all the dead go initially, regardless of their moral status in life. But Sheol isn't permanent. It's a waiting place where souls undergo purification and judgment before moving to their eternal destinations. This belief explains why funeral practices focus so heavily on helping the deceased navigate this transitional period successfully. You learn that the first 40 days after death are considered the most crucial for the soul's journey. During this period, the spirit is believed to hover near the body and the places where the person lived, reluctant to fully depart from earthly existence. The family's job is to help ease this transition through specific rituals designed to convince the soul that it's safe to let go of life and begin the journey to whatever comes next. The strangest aspect of these beliefs is how they influence physical treatment of the corpse. The body isn't just a discarded shell. It's considered a temporary anchor for the departing soul. This is why Hebrew burial customs emphasize keeping the body intact, why they avoid any practices that might damage or disfigure the corpse, why they wrap bodies carefully rather than simply covering them. They believe the soul needs the body to remain recognizable during the early stages of death. What's most fascinating is how these afterlife beliefs create ongoing responsibilities for the living toward the dead. Families are required to perform specific rituals during the year following a death, designed to assist the departed soul in its journey through Sheol. These aren't just memorial services. They're considered active interventions in the afterlife process, ways of sending help, prayers, and spiritual support to souls who are struggling with the challenges of death. You witness one of these post-death assistance rituals, and it's unlike anything you've imagined. The family gathers at the gravesite exactly 30 days after the burial, bringing food offerings that they don't leave at the tomb but consume themselves while sharing the meal spiritually with the deceased. They believe the dead can participate in earthly meals through the living, receiving nourishment for their spiritual journey through their family's consumption of sacred foods. The most complex aspect of Hebrew afterlife beliefs involves the concept of resurrection. Unlike many ancient cultures that saw death as final, Hebrew thought includes the possibility that the righteous dead will eventually return to physical life in perfected bodies. This belief profoundly influences funeral practices. Bodies must be preserved as intact as possible because they'll eventually be needed again when the general resurrection occurs. This resurrection belief explains many puzzling aspects of Hebrew burial customs. Why do they avoid cremation, which would destroy the body completely? Why do they place such emphasis on family burial plots, keeping related bodies together? Why do they mark graves so carefully and maintain detailed records of who is buried where? Because they expect these bodies to be reunited with their souls at some future date, and proper identification will be essential. But the most disturbing aspect of Hebrew afterlife beliefs is what they reveal about the fate of the wicked. While the righteous dead move through Sheol relatively quickly to their reward, the souls of those who violated divine law face much longer, more difficult journeys. Some are believed to remain trapped in Sheol indefinitely, suffering purification that may last for generations. Others face complete destruction, their souls annihilated rather than rewarded with eternal life. These beliefs about punishment in the afterlife create intense anxiety around death preparation. Families go to extraordinary lengths to ensure their deceased relatives are properly prepared for judgment, hiring special prayer specialists, performing elaborate purification rituals, even engaging in practices that blur the line between religion and magic. The stakes are literally eternal, and no expense or effort is too great to help a soul navigate the afterlife successfully. You witness a family consulting with a specialist in afterlife preparation, an expert who claims to know the specific challenges souls face in Sheol and the rituals that can help them overcome these obstacles. This practitioner describes a complex spiritual geography, different regions of the afterlife with different requirements, guardian spirits who must be appeased, tests that souls must pass to progress toward their final destination. It's like a spiritual travel guide for the dead. What's most remarkable is how these afterlife beliefs influence the behavior of the living. People modify their entire life patterns based on their understanding of what happens after death. They avoid certain sins not just because of earthly consequences, but because they fear the impact on their soul's journey through Sheol. They perform specific good deeds that are believed to create spiritual advantages in the afterlife. They maintain relationships with deceased relatives through ongoing rituals that are designed to benefit both the living and the dead. The economic impact of afterlife beliefs is staggering. Families spend enormous resources on death preparation, afterlife assistance rituals, and ongoing spiritual support for deceased relatives. They purchase expensive spices for body preparation, hire specialists to perform post-death ceremonies, maintain burial sites and memorial practices that consume significant portions of their income. Belief in the afterlife becomes a major economic force in ancient Hebrew society. But perhaps the strangest aspect of Hebrew afterlife beliefs is how they create a community that includes both living and dead members. The deceased aren't considered gone. They're considered relocated to a different realm, but still part of the family and community structure. Major decisions are made in consultation with dead ancestors. Important ceremonies include roles for deceased relatives, and the boundaries between life and death become fluid rather than absolute. As you observe the family continuing their complex relationship with their dead patriarch, you realize you're witnessing a worldview where death is understood as relocation rather than termination, where the afterlife is as real and detailed as earthly existence. where the living have ongoing responsibilities to help the dead navigate their new reality. These aren't primitive superstitions. They're sophisticated theological concepts that create a unified understanding of existence that spans both life and death, both temporal and eternal reality. Closing. As we reach the end of tonight's journey through the strange and fascinating world of biblical funeral practices, I hope you're lying there with a new appreciation for just how complex and sophisticated ancient approaches to death really were. These weren't primitive people stumbling through superstition. They were humans dealing with the same fundamental terror and mystery that we face today, but with systems of belief and practice that were far more elaborate and intricate than anything we've developed in our modern world. Tonight, we've explored burial preparations so detailed they turned death into a sacred art form, professional mourning that transformed grief into theatrical performance, tomb architecture that represented entire philosophies about family and eternity, preservation techniques that tried to cheat decay itself, funeral processions that reorganized entire cities around the passage of the dead, the natural beliefs that made death prediction into a survival skill, resurrection practices that blurred the line between medicine and magic, execution methods that turned killing into communication, mass burial catastrophes that revealed what happens when death overwhelms civilization, and afterlife beliefs so complex they created ongoing relationships between the living and the dead. What strikes me most about all of these practices is how they reveal a fundamental truth about human nature. We cannot accept death as simple ending. Whether through elaborate preservation, professional mourning, supernatural omens, resurrection attempts, or complex afterlife beliefs, every culture we've examined tonight was engaged in essentially the same project, refusing to let death have the final word, insisting that mortality is more complex than it appears, creating systems that make the end of life into something meaningful rather than simply final. The biblical world understood something we've largely forgotten: that death isn't just a medical event, but a social, spiritual, and cosmic transformation that affects entire communities and requires collective response. Their funeral practices weren't just about disposing of corpses. They were about maintaining the fabric of reality itself, ensuring that the departure of individuals didn't unravel the community's understanding of how existence works. Perhaps what's most remarkable is how these ancient practices reveal the same fears, hopes, and needs that drive modern attitudes toward death, just expressed through different cultural forms. We still struggle with preservation versus acceptance, individual versus community grief, natural versus supernatural explanations for mortality, the meaning of death in the context of ongoing life. The specifics have changed, but the fundamental human wrestling match with mortality continues unchanged. As you drift off to sleep tonight, maybe thinking about these strange biblical funeral practices will help you appreciate the continuity of human experience across millennia. The way our ancestors faced the same ultimate questions we're still trying to answer. The remarkable creativity humans have always shown when confronting the mystery of what it means to be mortal beings who can imagine either. Nidhi. Sweet dreams, and remember, no matter how strange these ancient practices might seem, they're all expressions of the same hope that someday, somehow, we might figure out what death really means and how to face it with dignity, community support, and maybe even a little bit of courage borrowed from the countless generations who have walked this path before us.